We begin tonight with General Philip Breedlove, retired four-star general in the Air Force, Supreme Allied Commander at NATO. Mark Dubowitz, CEO of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. With us in studio, Professor Kian Tajbakhsh, professor of international relations at NYU, who spent a year in solitary confinement in Evin prison after the 2009 Green Revolution. Gentlemen, glad to have all of you. I don't think any of you believe that the Iranian government is going to stop killing its own people or stop executions. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to start with the general here real quick. NBC News reporting, General, that President Trump says that if there is going to be military action, he wants a swift and decisive blow. The U.S. military is all-powerful. We've shown that. Can it deliver a blow which is both swift, decisive, and, as the president likes, without risk or significant risk to American military assets that changes the regime?
Well, that was a mouthful, and there were a lot of demands in that question. And
well, I've never known to be easy, General.
Let me start at the back end of it first. The idea that we believe we can change the regime with one strike, let's disabuse ourselves of that right away. And I'm not criticizing the idea of giving a strike. I think we have to send a message here, but I just want to temper everybody's expectations. Trying to change the mind of the senior leaders to stop doing what they think is existential to their control of the country by a swift strike is going to be pretty tough. Now, we can and have the ability to put a punishing blow in there. You saw Operation Rising Lion and then Midnight Hammer. We know what we can go in there and do. The question is finding the right target set that sends the message to the leadership of the regime and says, knock it off, or this is going to get really ugly for you.
Mark, at some point, is it not incumbent on those who want military action and keep talking about the need for military action to talk about what comes the day after, and then what, of who is going to take over Iran?
Well, for sure it is, and I think you've already got the blueprint, and you've already got a prominent opposition leader, Reza Pahlavi, the exiled crown
he's not
prince.
Coming back. Come on.
Well,
really?
Yeah, I wouldn't ridicule him so quickly. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who did. I think he's shown that he's got significant support inside the country. He's made it very clear that he wants to be a transitional figure and lead the country to a referendum and to democracy. There's no doubt that he is much more popular today, and his name is being chanted on the streets of Iran. There's no other names that are being chanted. He's also put together something called the Iran Prosperity Project, which are really dozens of experts on economy and governance and internal security that have got actually a day after plan. So, you know, they may not survive contact with the enemy, but a lot of really painstaking work has been done in that regard.
Okay. Kian, this is an important point, and I think the general made this idea that you're somehow, with military force, going to force the Iranian regime to stop shooting their own protesters. The question is this, right? If given a choice between being ousted by the protesters or face American bombing, this existential threat that it seems as though the regime feels it faces, what are they going to choose?
I think it's very clear, if you know how the Islamic Republic works, you will know that they are in for the long haul.
Meaning they'll fight to the death.
They will fight to the death. I think many people don't understand that, or at least they don't believe when they hear slogans such as death to America or death to Israel. Many people in the United States and Europe, they tend to say these are just really slogans. They don't really mean them. They're used as bargaining chips to sort of, or they're bluster. It's not true. I remember speaking with the interrogator, IRGC officers.
So just to say, IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard, so the people who are right now shooting everybody in the streets, and we'll put up some of that video, are the people who were interrogating you in Evin prison?
Indeed. I was in their special high security wing of Evin prison.
Sounds like a nice vacation.
Yeah, and I had I had the privilege of being up front with a lot of these senior officers and lower officers. Let me tell you, when I came out of that experience, I had lost any doubt in my mind that these are they are true believers.
They're fanatics.
They are fanatics in this sense, but you got to understand that they live in a world in which they're deeply committed to the principles of the Islamic Republic. They are deeply committed to an anti-American vision of the world. They're deeply committed to that, and they're going to dig in.
Okay, I want to sort of bring this back to Mark. Just President Trump in the past couple of minutes speaking about the Crown Prince. He seems very nice, but I don't know how he'd play within his own country, Trump said, and we really aren't up to that point yet. I don't know whether or not his country would accept his leadership. Certainly, if they would, that would be fine to me. Headline from Reuters, Trump questions Rajapaksa's ability to garner support in Iran. I keep thinking that this idea, especially given what Kian just said about where the regime is, that somehow you're going to sort of take out the upper echelon in targeted strikes and bring in this president in a box, if you will, or president in a Gulf Stream, and we're done in a couple of days, and suddenly there's elections in Iran, just seems fanciful to me.
Yeah, listen, I mean, there's a whole bunch of scenarios. Many of them are scenarios that could go really badly. There's scenarios that could go really well. I think if you're going to be serious and thoughtful about this, you're going to do a whole series of planning. Now, you know, we'd love to see Jeffersonian democracy in the heart of Tehran with a pro-America, pro-West supporter. But it may be that it's a military general. It may be that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, by the way, it's not the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. There's nothing Iranian about it. It's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. It's 120,000 strong. There are men there that are there because they're true believers, as your guest said. There are men there also because they have significant economic interests.
Right.
And they want to preserve those economic interests, and they also want to stay alive. And there may be somebody who's more pragmatic, less fanatic, less ideological.
Okay. I see that. You know, General, I think about this when I'm watching the video of the body bags. It looks a lot like Syria to me in the very beginning. We used to see that after the protests. It also reminds me a little bit of Libya. You were, I believe, the general in charge of what basically became the rebels' close air support, and I was on the ground with the rebels at that time. So you and I had different perspectives on Libya. But if I'm an Iranian leader looking at either Syria or Libya, to me, it's either I die fighting or I die at the hands of a bombing raid or I die by my own people taking me as they did Gaddafi and slaughtering me in a very grotesque way and putting me in a ditch. Why, if you're that 130,000 strong IRGC, why wouldn't you fight to the death?
Well, it's back to your first question and why we talked to the last piece at first. The tools that we have are not, they're exquisite and magnificent at destroying military and industrial capability. They're not so exquisite at changing the minds of those who are running this trying to maintain control of the country. And so you've hit the problem right on the head. What is it that we do with our capabilities that either better positions the revolution to succeed or convinces the leadership that they're not going to make it through? And I heard in another conversation today, that may be, as the Israelis did in Rising Lion, that may mean striking leadership targets.
Yeah, I want to end with you, Kian, because I think this is so important. One of, I thought, the really shameful things of the Obama administration was turning their back on the Green Revolution. There were thousands of people, tens of thousands of people in the streets as you were risking your life for freedom and for a better life. And the Obama administration basically said, we don't want to be accused of getting involved, so we're not going to get involved. And then, of course, Iran accused America of being involved anyway. Are you seeing a noted difference in how this revolution and these images are being treated by the American public, more importantly, the American administration, than they were in 2009?
I think it's very clear that it's being treated very differently by the American administration.
And that's a good thing.
That's a good thing. I don't have a good sense of how it's being played around the country and how it's being consumed by the average American viewer. But I think that currently the American administration, Trump administration, is in a good place to find a good balance between ambition and realism.
Give me a sense. I just want to put these pictures back up. You've been on the streets as the IRGC is firing at people and setting things on fire in that fight. What is going through those protesters' minds right now?
Well, we don't know a lot about who all the different protesters are, but one of the things is absolute frustration and anger at the authorities.
Yeah, they're feeling they have nothing to lose.
Inside Iran, they have nothing to lose. The problem is for the revolution and where that can go is that it's not so important who is in the street, it's who isn't in the street, and how the millions of the middle class who are fence sitters, what would bring them out? And I think that's the big question.
Well, you would know. We appreciate you being here. Thank you
very much.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.